Welcome back, where every timestamp has a witness. Today we trace a treaty, a gold rush, and a valley that pivoted history. If you love the stories few dare to tell, fully hit subscribe. June 25th, 1876. The valley of the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory lay quiet under cottonwoods and heat. Along a long bend of water, a great village stood. The Oceti Sakowin, also called the Lakota, camped with the Tsitsistas, also called the Northern Cheyenne, and a small Arapaho party. Ponies grazed in the meadows, children swam at the fords. The day looked ordinary until dust rose on the far ridges. From the north and east, the United States Seventh Cavalry approached in a three-column plan meant to find and compel non-treaty bands to agencies. George Armstrong Custer led one column. Crow and Arikara scouts ranged ahead and to the flanks. In the village, leaders and relatives kept daily work moving. Sitting Bull, a respected medicine person, carried a recent Sundance vision of soldiers entering camp and falling. Fact and faith met on the same ground. The actors were many and precise. On one side, the 7th Cavalry, with 12 companies, a slow pack train, and orders to strike and to drive people to agency control. On the other side, the Lakota with Cheyenne and Arapaho allies moving for grass, water, and safety after months of pressure in the Black Hills and across the unceded country. Both sides believed speed would decide the day. Both sides read the same wind in different ways. The central question sits plainly in this valley. What led these nations and this regiment to meet here on this date, and why did that meeting decide the outcome? The answer matters beyond these ridges. It ties a vision to maneuver, a treaty promise to a summer march, and a community of lodges to a doctrine of force. By fixing the time, the place, and the people we can follow, how choice terrain and policy combined to shape what followed on the river and the high ground. The long path to the valley began with a promise on paper. In 1868, at Fort Laramie, the United States recognized the Black Hills for the Oceti Sakowin and set a wide, unceded hunting range west to the Powder and Tongue. The words looked firm, but the ground shifted fast. In 1872 and 1873, survey parties for a northern railroad probed across the Yellowstone. In 1874, a military reconnaissance under Custer entered the Black Hills and reported gold. That summer and fall, streams of miners crossed into treaty land. By 1875, the territorial press spoke of towns where the map said Lakota land. Negotiation sessions in the fall of 1875 tried to trade the hills for money and rations. Many leaders refused. At year-end, a federal order required Lakota people outside the agencies to report by a winter deadline. January 31st, 1876 passed with snow on the plains and lodges spread for winter hunting. In the spring, the War Department issued a campaign plan to compel movement. Pressure came on several lines at once. Buffalo herds had thinned after years of hide hunting and market demand. Military posts advanced along rivers. Freight roads and survey lines made fixed corridors across grass that once carried only winter trails. Agency rules grew tighter. Officials bargained with ration cuts and threatened to halt beef issue to force signatures. School regimes pressed children away from camps and planting and hunting seasons. The shift from war to interior and day-to-day management did not soften the spring plan. The field would belong to columns. In March and April 1863, United States forces began to move. One under Terry with Gibbon ranged from the Yellowstone. One under Crook came up from the Platte. A third under Custer and the 7th Cavalry would break from the Yellowstone in June to probe south and west. Orders aimed to locate large traveling villages and to fix them in place for a strike. Couriers carried instructions across big gaps where telegraph wires ended at forts. Pack trains and mule wagons set the pace. Horses needed grass and water and could not be hurried beyond a few long days without loss. On the Lakota and Cheyenne side, the winter had been hard but not broken. Families camped along timbered draws where wood and shelter held. Men hunted where herds still flowed. In late spring, the lodges drew together on better grass and moved north and west to find buffalo and to remain at distance from agency lines. The objective was simple and old: keep the people fed, safe, and free to choose seasonal rounds. The constraint was also old and now heavier. The country narrowed as posts and roads cut across it. News of soldiers came by runners and by the sight of dust on far divides. Logistics were what a village could carry and what the pony herds could sustain. Women managed the labor that kept movement possible. Scouts watched the high ground and counted fires at night. Immediate triggers stacked in weeks, not months. The failure to meet the winter reporting order gave officials the pretext to define all outside lodges as hostile. In May and June, rations at some agencies dipped as pressure for signatures on the Black Hills question rose. Traders pushed deeper toward the hills despite protests. Couriers from scouts and allies told of heavy army sign along the Yellowstone and Powder. On June 17th, near the Rosebud, a large force of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne met and turned back Crook. That fight bought time and warned that more columns were near. Each side held a clear objective shaped by its own map. For the United States, it was to find, compel, and concentrate people at agencies. For the Lakota and Cheyenne and the small Arapaho party, it was to avoid encirclement and to keep the village together in strong country with waterwood and grass. Constraints pulled against both aims. The army depended on supply distance and coordination between columns that could not see one another. The village depended on speed knowledge of the ground and the ability to move non-combatants while readying riders to shield them. Logistics snapshots show the limits. The 7th Cavalry fielded 12 companies with a slow pack train behind and scouts from Crow and Arikara nations out front. Cartridges rode in mule boxes and in belts across saddles. The regiment left its Gatling guns to move faster. For the village, thousands of ponies formed the living train. Lodge poles dragged on travois, meat and hides filled parfleches. Water crossings and coulees that barely slowed a rider could choke a line of loaded mules. Both maps favored those who knew the small fords and the folds that hid approach. Policy framed the summer. The United States read the treaty as revocable by act and appropriation. The Oceti Sakowin read the treaty as a promise tied to the earth itself. Between those readings stood the Black Hills, with miners already digging. Sitting Bull's Sundance in early June bound resolve in a language of prayer and vision. Army orders bound resolve in a language of dates, routes, and concentration. The two languages moved toward the same bend of river. By June 22nd, the 7th Cavalry broke camp on the Yellowstone. By dawn, June 25th, dust rose above the divide east of the Little Bighorn. The buildup was over. The meeting was at hand. Early June, 1876. The Rosebud country held new grass under a hard blue sky. Lakota bands of the Hunkpapa, Oglala, and Miniconjou moved with Northern Cheyenne allies along timbered draws. Women cut lodge poles and dried meat. Men ranged wide for buffalo and for word of soldiers. To the south, General Crook pushed up from the Platte. Scouts from the Shoshone and Crow watched his line. Couriers moved from hill to hill with reports. The weather stayed dry. Smoke carried far. June 17th. The warning turned into contact. Near the headwaters of the Rosebud Creek, a large Lakota and Northern Cheyenne force intercepted Crook. The fight opened in the cool of morning and ran in waves over broken ground until midday. From the Lakota side, Crazy Horse and other leaders pulled riders to the flanks to force the soldiers off the benches and back toward their pack train. From the Northern Cheyenne side, Two Moons and Wooden Leg recalled dust and heat and the long exchange of fire across ridges cut by draws. Crook held his ground, but did not press forward. That choice mattered. He turned back to the south to reorganize. Telegraph lines from his base carried the news late and in pieces. The right hand of the campaign no longer tied into the left. For the traveling village, the immediate effect was time. The lodges lifted and moved toward the Little Bighorn, where waterwood and grass ran together. During those same days, agency pressure deepened to the east. Along the Missouri line, ration issues dipped as officials argued over signatures tied to the Black Hills. Arikara and Crow men who chose to scout for the Army left their homes under agency flags and rode west. Their families watched the bluffs for smoke that would mark their return. Messages between forts moved by telegraph to the end of the wire and then by courier across open country. Each relay added hours. News of the Rosebud fight reached Terry and Gibbon on the Yellowstone, but the scale and meaning were unclear. The paper trail was thin. The field demanded decisions. June 20th, the 7th Cavalry broke camp on the Yellowstone. Orders from Terry set Custer to move south, then west, to find the trail of the large village, and to strike if a fair chance appeared while coordinating with Gibbon. The regiment left the Gatling guns to gain speed. Crow and Arikara scouts rode ahead into the flanks. The pack train with cartridges and rations followed in dust. The days were hot. Water lay in long loops of river and in few springs. Horses sweated and needed rest. The regiment crossed country cut by dry coulees that hid movement at one turn and exposed it at the next. Interpreters bridged languages between officers and scouts. Meanings still slipped. A sign that to one man meant a day old might to another mean hours. June 24th, on a high divide east of the Little Bighorn, the scouts found a camp circle still warm and pony droppings that had not yet dried. They counted many lodge positions. They saw drag marks of travois and the crossing of many herds. One scout cut open a dead buffalo and found the meat still red within. They judged the village near. On a ridge now called the Crow Nest, the scouts tried to show Custer the valley smoke. Morning haze and distance made the view uncertain. Arguments followed. Some warned the village was far larger than expected, and that daylight would bring discovery if the regiment held in place. Others pushed to strike before the village scattered. Custer chose to move. The decision set the next incident in motion. Midday, June 25th, near the upper fords of the Little Bighorn, Major Reno took 3 companies down a dry draw to the timber, then across the river to the south end of the village. Women were digging wild turnips in the meadows. Children swam at a bend. The first fire sent them running. Riders came out from the village in rising numbers. The charge slowed on open benches where the grass ran short and no cover stood. Reno dismounted to form a skirmish line. Dust and heat blinded men on both sides. Ammunition boxes opened in the timber. Messages rode back toward the bluffs. A pullback became a run to the ford. Some men crossed. Some fell in the brush and water. The immediate effect was to fix a large body of fighters in the valley, while new dust rose on the ridges to the north. At the same time, the regiment's left wing under Benteen had ridden a scouting arc over rough uplands. That arc cost time and distance. When Benteen angled back, he found Reno on a hill above the valley, with wounded men and a shaken line. A messenger reached him, with a plea to bring packs and to come quick. The pack train labored miles behind over broken ground. Mules balked at steep draws. Cartridge boxes sat in those panniers as the day burned. The chain of supply that linked the regiment to its bullets now stretched and snagged. A few minutes became an hour. An hour became a gap that no later courage could close. Farther north, 5 companies under Custer moved along a ridge system that ran toward a place later called Calhoun Hill, and then to a last rise. The path forced the companies into files along narrow crests. Coolies cut the ground into pockets. At least one probe angled toward a northern ford, where the river bent close to the bluffs. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders met it at a run. The push and counterpush rolled back and forth across low mounds and draws. Non-combatants loaded travois and drove pony herds away from the nearest lodges toward safer bends. The village itself began to thin and move, even as fighters wheeled back to the ridges. That motion meant there would be no single fixed point to seize and hold. Every minute, the village traded space for time while massing more riders at the points that mattered. A scout left a plain note about what the first clear look had revealed and what it meant for risk. Varnum Field notes, High Bluffs above Little Bighorn, June 25, 1876. We saw smoke running long and low, and the pony herds lay like drifted dark over the flats. It was a village greater than any I had counted before. If we waited for morning, all would know we were here. The fight then split into 2 distinct fires. To the south, Reno and later Benteen held on a hill, with shallow rifle pits carved by knives and cups and hands. The sun pounded men and animals. Water lay below under deadly ground. Volunteers made dusk runs to the river and back with canteens. To the north, the 5 companies along the ridges tried to feel for a crossing or a line of advance while warriors closed from the village side and from the dry gullies behind. Signals could not carry across the folds. Couriers risked open slopes where every rider drew fire. An interpreter at one position misread a gesture. Another message arrived late because a horse went down in a wash. Small delays compounded. The regiment no longer moved as one mind. Immediate effects showed in human terms. Families fled with children and elders toward safer bends and willowed islands. Women pulled wounded men from the timber along the southern ford and covered them with robes. On the hill, a surgeon cut and bandaged without sleep. In the ridges, horses fell, and men formed small clusters behind their bodies. Ammunition ran pocket to pocket across open ground, as runners tried to keep fire from going silent. By late afternoon, the weight of riders on the northern ground grew. The valley fight settled into a siege. The day had started with one village and one regiment moving toward a question. It now held 2 battles linked by dust, and by the time it took for a message to cross bad land. The regiment's order of battle on June 25th set 3 teeth and 1 root. Major Reno led 3 companies toward the valley floor to strike the south end of the village. Captain Benteen held 3 companies to scout the left and then support as needed. Lieutenant Colonel Custer rode the high ridges with 5 companies angling for the northern quarter. Company B guarded and drove the pack train with the bulk of the cartridges and medical stores. Crow and Arikara scouts fanned forward and out on both flanks. The march from the Yellowstone on June 20th through rolling basins and dry coulees favored speed at first and then punished it. Grass thinned on the divides. Fords were few and crooked. Choke points ran where narrow spurs forced single files with steep drop on either side. Telegraphed guidance ended at the last forts. From that point, orders were paper and voice over distance. The rules of engagement came in the form of a written instruction to find and strike if a fair chance appeared, and to join with Gibbon if not. The frame was compulsion toward agency control under a summer timeline. That frame gave wide latitude to act on contact and carried the risk that speed would outrun information. The regiment left its Gatling guns to gain hours on the approach. Those hours later belonged to the pack train and to the cartridges that could not be everywhere at once. Late morning, Reno crossed at a low ford and pushed across open benches toward the southern tip of the village. The ground offered little cover beyond the timber belt along the river and thin willow near bends. At first contact, the line moved at a trot and then a gallop. It met a growing shield of mounted warriors who sought to slow and then turn the charge. Under rising fire, and with space too open for a close push, Reno dismounted and formed a skirmish line with horses led to the rear. The line fired by volley and then by file, as riders tried to close within good range. Presently, the weight against the left and the right forced a pull into the timber. The timber held shade and trunks, but no deep protection. When the order to withdraw came, it moved faster than the ground allowed. Men crossed at the ford in clusters and by swimming. Some never reached the far bank. The rally on the high hill above the valley formed a rough perimeter. Shallow rifle pits began with knives and cups. The hill had wind and sun and a view that did not include what happened to the north. Benteen, meanwhile, had cut a wide scouting arc that cost time and distance. When he angled back, he reached the hill, where Reno held with wounded men and shaken companies. The pack train under Company B labored miles behind over bad draws. The supply chain that linked the hill and the ridges to ammunition and water now stretched thin. Couriers rode between positions with orders and pleas. One famous penciled slip has come down from the ridges. Cook, order, note fragment, high ridges east of Little Bighorn, June 25, 1876. Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. On the northern ridges, Custer's 5 companies moved along a knife-backed spine toward a place later named Calhoun Hill, and then further to the last rise. The village lay to their left across broken draws. At least one probe angled toward a ford where the river bent close. Warriors met that probe head-on to push the fight back onto dry ground. The companies were forced into thin lines by the terrain, the distances between coulees growing meaningful with each minute. Ammunition carriers ran belts forward under fire. Horses bunched and tore away when bullets found them. Company positions fell into pockets that could not easily support one another. Maneuver became a contest in timing. In the valley, the hill position under Reno, and then Benteen stabilized into a siege by mid-afternoon. Water lay below under fire. Volunteers made dusk runs for canteens. On the ridges, the northern fight moved from probe to defense. A company on Calhoun Hill tried to anchor along a crest, while a sister company formed a line down the slope. Mounted Lakota and Northern Cheyenne climbed the folds where small mounds gave momentary cover, then rushed short distances to close range. From the draws behind the ridge, other groups worked up into the gaps. When one pocket gave way, the next was flanked. The final cluster gathered around dead horses pulled into a low wall on the last rise. Fire slowed and then stopped. An after-action recollection from the hill captures the pressure and the necessity that held the line through the second day. Benteen After-Action Testimony Hill, above Little Bighorn, January 1879. We entrenched with knives, spoons, and hands. The wounded lay in all quarters. Water was life, and men went for it under fire. We held because there was nothing else to do. Casualty ranges are best stated with care. On the northern ridges, 5 companies were lost with over 200 dead. On the hill and during the river withdrawal, dozens were killed and wounded. The United States total dead are commonly recorded around 260, with small variance by role. Native losses are reported across a broad span from several dozen to near 100, depending on which lists and family accounts are counted. Numbers for women and children wounded in the first shock at the south end are present in some oral histories and absent in many Army returns, and thus remain in dispute. Fact and folklore also meet at the river bends, where different witnesses place or deny a last attempt to force a crossing near the northern ford. The ground record and early drawings indicate multiple small surges and envelopment rather than a single grand charge on a fixed square. Non-combatants shaped the field and suffered it. Women pulled children and elders towards safer bends and willowed islands as the first fire spread. Pony herds moved at a run, their dust hiding and revealing movement in the same breath. In the timber by the southern ford, women pulled wounded men clear and covered them with robes. On the hill, a surgeon worked until his hands bled raw under dust and sun. Cartridges ran belt to hand across open ground. When the night came, it carried water runs under low light and whispered passwords. Logistics stress tells the ending as plainly as any map. The pack trains miles behind the ridges were measured in the time it took to shift the outcome. Mules balked at steep cuts and slid in loose shale. The regiment that had chosen speed left behind weight that could have been decisive in cartridges and particularly in the ability to concentrate. The village, by contrast, drew its logistics from motion. Travois rolled as families cleared the lodges nearest to the fighting. The village traded space for time and gained both. By the hour when the northern fight tightened to its last crest, many non-combatants were already well downstream and beyond reach. By evening, the valley fire dropped to sporadic shots. On the ridges it fell silent. Night under a hard sky marked the end of one fight and the preparation for another. Morning, June 26th, brought renewed pressure on the hill, and a rough ring of pits held with short rations and shorter sleep. The pack train stood inside the line, by then its animals tied down to form walls. Cartridges were counted by handfuls. The sun climbed. Warriors tested the edges. By afternoon, the test eased. A relief column appeared from the north, as the great village had already lifted beyond the bends. One more brief note of fact versus folklore belongs in the close. Later stories sometimes compress the day into a single doomed rush by the last companies, or into a single named champion turning the tide. The strongest record in drawings, ledgers, testimony, and archaeology shows a collapse in segments under converging attacks across broken ground, where sight lines fooled both sides. Leadership mattered in dozens of short sprints rather than in one banner moment. The confrontation therefore reads as a geometry of separation and supply under a policy clock that ran too fast for certainty. Orders framed action, terrain fixed choices. Families moved under cover and returned for their dead. When the sound dropped from the ridges, the questions left behind shifted from attack and defense to law and land. The campaign's combat path had reached its limit. The next movement would be in offices and in memory, but the ground here kept the imprint of where each line finally stopped. December 4th, 2016 marks the hinge. Washington announces that the Army will not grant an easement for a pipeline crossing beneath Lake Wahe. Snow lies thin on the flats north of the reservation. At the river, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Hunkpapa, Lakota, and Yanktonai Dakota, and their allies stand in cold light. In offices, the Corps initiates further review. The who is precise. Tribal leadership and youth who carried petitions to the Capitol, elders who kept camp discipline, agency officials who hold the pen on the easement, company executives who must explain delay, state and county officers who continue nightly rotations on Highway 1806. The where is Lake Wahe and the corridor north of the reservation boundary. The when is early winter as temperatures fall below freezing, and the highway remains blocked at a narrow span called Backwater Bridge. Objectives and constraints are balanced like weights on a scale. For the tribe and its allies, the objective is to stop the underlake crossing and compel a full environmental impact statement with real consideration of alternate routes. Constraints include weather camp logistics, arrest exposure, and the narrowing window before deep winter. For the Corps, the objective is a defensible decision under law. Constraints include an administrative record still in motion and a growing measure of controversy that may trigger higher-level review. For state and county agencies, the objective is order on the road. Constraints are months-long deployments, overtime budgets, and national scrutiny of tactics. For the developer, the objective is clear service of the line. Constraints concentrate at one point, a federal easement under Lake Wahe that is now denied. The immediate effect is an initiative shift. The decision halts the final segment and signals that consultation issues and cultural site risks require more analysis. On the ground, the camps exhale in relief and then turn to packing lists and departure plans before the next storm. In company filings, the tone tightens. In state briefings, the bridge remains a security point through the holidays. For the Corps, the decision resets the review to a slower track with broader public comment. The narrative moves from confrontation on a road to procedure at a desk. The admission against interest belongs to the party most invested in speed. Company Council Court Filing Excerpt. Washington, 2. The project is substantially complete, and only the Lake Wahe segment lacks authorization. Each month of delay imposes significant and unrecoverable economic harm on the developer and shippers. The easement decision is therefore outcome determinative. Those lines explain why December 4th is the turn. The company says in its own voice that a single federal signature decides the project's fate. That is the definition of leverage. It also explains the quick reversal in late January when a new policy directive instructs agencies to expedite the file. The pivot from denial to grant is not a contradiction in the record. It is the record changing under new direction. The result is a brief pause, then a return to construction during winter. Counterfactual analysis remains narrow and sourced. If the easement had been approved before September, the crossing likely would have been complete by early winter, with fewer large encampments and fewer national cameras on the corridor. If the December denial had stayed in force through the first quarter of 2017, an alternate route analysis may have pushed the crossing away from Lake Oahe or extended review until spring runoff changing cost and risk calculations. The actual course threaded between those poles, a short denial, a rapid policy shift, and a spring completion while litigation continued. The human cost sits beside the policy arc and should be stated plainly. Hundreds of arrests across late summer and fall. Injuries from impact munitions and chemical agents on the November night at the bridge. Dozens treated for hypothermia after water streams struck people in sub-freezing air. Families moved in and out of winter shelters that rose from tents to plywood to yurts as the cold deepened. The displacement path is local and seasonal rather than across long miles. People left the flats not because a village was burned, but because winter and enforcement deadlines and the December decision combined to wind the camps down. In winter counts from this period, the motif is a narrow bridge under floodlights and a spray of water that turns to mist in the beam. Ledger images show flags along a ridge and a line of people in parkas with breath in the air. Names persist in community lists of those arrested, those who cooked, those who stood as medics, and those who ran petitions to the Capitol. Weather and orders also frame the turn. The denial arrives into a forecast of deeper cold. That alone changes risk tolerances in camp kitchens and medic tents. Elders urge departures before blizzard conditions. At the same time, the highway remains blocked, and detours add hours to routine trips for reservation residents. The pause in construction does not reopen the road. It does not return seized equipment. It does not erase court dates. It changes the center of gravity from the river to Washington and buys time for the legal case. Synthesis back to the structural forces of P2 shows the through line. Treaty language concerning territory and federal obligations set the moral and legal frame. The National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act set the procedural frame with consultation and controversy as key triggers. The creation of Lake Oahe from mid-century dam projects made the tribe's drinking water source the exact location of risk. Rapid oil development in the Bakken created pressure to move product to market, which moved route decisions toward major rivers and existing corridors. Each force is visible at the turning point. Treaty and consultation claim the easement. Environmental law opens a door to deeper review. The dam-era's lake makes any spill intolerable at that intake. The market clock ticks loud enough that company counsel puts urgency into the record. The December denial compresses all those forces into a single date that both sides can point to when explaining what the winter meant. The turn also redefines roles. For months, the youth who organized the first camp and the runners who carried the message to Washington had been the face of the movement. After the denial, attorneys and agency specialists take the foreground while the runners return to school and families. For months, the sheriff's office and mutual aid partners measured success by the line on a bridge. After the denial, their metric is orderly drawdown and reopened roads. For months, the developer measured success by linear feet per day. After the denial, it is measured in days to a new signature. The Corps, once a background actor in a rural controversy, becomes the central decision-maker in a national debate over consent and risk. A turning point does not end a story. It sets the next terms. In this case, the terms include a swift federal reversal. In January, an easement in February, and oil in the line by early summer, while the court requires a full environmental impact statement 2 years later. Yet the December pause changed the file in a permanent way. It established in the record that tribal consultation and cultural site protection could stop a major project at the water's edge. It proved that controversy at a reservation intake could require higher-level review. It showed banks and city councils that the phrase "water is life" would not fade when the last tent came down. That is why the date matters and why the winter still holds in memory along a river bend where the bridge lights once cut through steam and snow. The turn fixed itself in early afternoon June 25th on the high, dry ridges east of the Little Bighorn. 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry stood strung along coulees between Calhoun Hill and the last rise. Reno and Benteen held a separate hill above the southern ford. The village of the Lakota Northern Cheyenne and a small Arapaho party had begun to move lodges downstream, even as fighters massed against each exposed crest. The objective for the regiment was to strike hard and compel dispersal toward agency control. The objective for the village was to shield families and keep cohesion while pushing the soldiers off the close ground. Constraints decided which aim could live. Ammunition on the ridges ran by pockets and runners. Cartridges in the pack train were minutes that became an hour and then were gone. Water lay below under fire. Orders that had value in the morning lost value when lines could no longer see one another. Heat dust and broken sight turned signals into guesses. On Calhoun Hill, a company tried to hold a spine that narrowed to a blade. Downslope, another company formed to refuse a flank. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne riders climbed the folds in short surges, using each low mound as a breath and then closing to carbine and repeating rifle range. From the draws on the far side, other groups worked up behind the ridge pockets. When one pocket fell, the next one bent. Horses went down and men dragged their bodies into a low wall. Captain Keogh died near his guidon where the line had tried to pivot. Farther along the crest, Captain Yates and men of two companies fell in clusters. Lieutenant Cook's mustache and notebook would be found in the dust. To the south on the hill, above the valley, surgeons cut and bandaged without sleep, while shallow pits grew around mules tied down as walls. Volunteers ran for water at dusk and came back with canteens and holes in them. The immediate effect on the ridges was an irreversible loss of initiative. Every minute not spent in a clean movement to the river or a junction with the hill became a minute spent in defense on worse ground. The initiative shifted to the village fighters, who could concentrate at the ridge pockets while non-combatants cleared the nearest lodges and drove pony herds beyond the bends. The regiment had divided to move faster. The ground divided it again and kept it so. Weather and heat drained men and animals. The sun lowered. The last rise shortened. When the final cluster stopped firing, the field fell silent except for wind. A narrow counterfactual fits the evidence. If the entire regiment had concentrated on the hill above the southern ford in the first hour, the combined fire and the ready cartridges might have held through the night and allowed a coordinated withdrawal with fewer losses. If the entire regiment had driven deep at the first shock on the south end of the village, the lodges might have scattered too fast to mass riders on the ridges. Both paths run through constraints already present. They require time for messages that did not arrive, grass and water, for horses that were spent, and packed train cartridges that were still miles away on bad ground. The human cost shows in names and in winter count marks. On the ridges, George Armstrong Custer died with his brothers Tom and Boston and brother-in-law James Calhoun. Company guidons lay near the bodies of Keogh and Yates. In the valley and on the hills, men of Reno and Benteen carried the wounded through dust that clung to bandages. Among the Northern Cheyenne losses, lame white man fell in the northern fight, a leader whose death is remembered in family accounts. Lakota and Cheyenne families later drew the day in ledger books, each figure a rider or a fallen body beside a horse, each mark a claim that this ground carried their memory as much as any stone. Winter counts named the year for the fight, and then named the later season when the herds fell away and hunger came. The displacement path went from the Little Bighorn to the next campaigns, then to agency lines, then to allotment surveys, and the long pressure that followed. One admission against interest from the United States side sits close to the turn and speaks directly to scale and misread risk. Terry official letter near mouth of the Bighorn River, June 27, 1876. The village proved far larger than any estimate I had received. Our movements did not unite in time, and the result has been most unfortunate. That line returns us to the structural forces set in motion before the first shots. The treaty framework of 1868 said the Black Hills and the unceded country were promised to the Oceti Sakowin. The discovery of gold and the late 1875 order that pushed non-treaty bands to report in winter reset the policy clock. The summer campaign then asked 3 columns to act as one mind across a country that broke messages and forced decisions at the edge of sight. On the day itself, the regiment's choice to divide and to outrun the pack train reflected that clock. The village's choice to protect non-combatants first and to mass riders where ground allowed reflected an older clock that measured safety by cohesion and by water and grass, not by timetables at forts. The turning point was therefore not a single last rush or a banner moment by one name. It was the hour when separation and supply made a junction impossible, when the regiment lost the ability to choose a path, and when the village, having cleared its people to safer bends, could shape the field in converging arcs. After that hour, the rest was gravity. The northern pockets shrank. The hill above the southern ford survived because it dug, and because cartridges finally reached it inside a ring of mules. By the next day, the village had lifted and gone, and the questions left behind moved from rifles to records. The meaning of the turn reaches past the bodies on the ground. It linked a summer order to a battlefield geometry, and then to the policy that followed. Within months, pressure on the Black Hills hardened into seizure. Campaigns pressed through winter. Agency life narrowed. Schools took children in seasons when families had once moved with herds. Yet the ledger drawings and the June commemorations show continuance alongside loss. The vision carried into battle was not only a line about soldiers falling, it was a claim that a people could hold together under pressure long enough to move their families and to remind a distant government that promises made on paper stand or fail in places like this under a hard sun with water just out of reach. The day after the guns fell quiet, the story moved from ridges to records. Officers filed terse reports to the Department of the Dakota and to Washington. Couriers carried casualty rolls and sketched maps back to posts along the Yellowstone. Within weeks, administrative questions outpaced battlefield questions. Who would be compelled to agencies? Which leaders would be arrested or watched? How would rations be used to force signatures on a new Black Hills settlement? The summer fight became a winter of paperwork that fixed new boundaries and narrowed older rights. Law and administration took their first shape in late 1870 when officials framed an agreement to cede the Black Hills and to confine travel to agency lines. The statute that followed in 1870 in the United States Statutes at Large recorded the seizure and tied future annuities to acceptance. Agency superintendents then used ration issue as leverage and cut beef when bands resisted. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1870 described this policy in the plain terms of supply and compliance. A year later, the annual report of the Secretary of War for 1878 noted continued operations to compel holdouts to surrender and to disarm those who still ranged between the powder and tongue. In the same period, boards assembled to review the regiment's conduct. The Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879 gathered testimony about the hill fight, the withdrawal through the timber, and the time it took to reunite the scattered elements. No single paper could undo the summer, but together these records formed the scaffolding for what followed. Transfers and arrests touched households that had only days before moved lodges along the Little Bighorn. Parties of Lakota surrendered at agencies along the Missouri and were counted into ration rolls. Northern Cheyenne families were pushed south in 1807 toward Indian Territory with thin supplies and sick children. Some later turned north in the winter exodus remembered, in family accounts and in Army returns as the Dull Knife breakout. Reservation boundaries that had been sketched in the treaty era now hardened in field orders and in surveyor notes. Access to hunting grounds west of the Black Hills closed. When the Dawes allotment regime began a decade later, it would subdivide communal land into parcels and open the remainder to leasing and sale. The seeds of that policy can already be read in the post-battle correspondence that called for fixed residence and supervised labor. Land and resource use around the hills accelerated. Mining districts grew under territorial sanction. Grazing leases crept outward along rail spurs that reached the foothills with ties and bridge timbers cut from river bottoms. Road rights-of-way crossed places where families had once dug turnips and set fish traps. Agency reports counted bales of hay cut within reservation lines and tallied cattle delivered on contract. The language of those ledgers sounds dry until one reads them alongside the ration complaints and the sickness lists. The resource shift carried a body count in slow time. Demography and health changed from season to season. The Indian census rolls in later decades would show lowered birth counts and raised death counts in some years at Pine Ridge, Rosebud, and Standing Rock. Agency physicians recorded measles and whooping cough outbreaks among children who lived in close quarters near issue houses and schools. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, 1878, noted shortages of flour and bacon during winter months at several agencies and urged more regular transport from railheads to depots. Army surgeons in posts along the Missouri logged scurvy and dysentery in ration months when fresh meat ran short. Each column of figures has a face behind it. Families that had moved fast to lift lodges from the Little Bighorn now moved slowly between issue day and school day. School regimes began to fix new rhythms. In 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School opened far to the east. Agency agents on the Missouri recruited or compelled children to go there and to other boarding schools closer to home. Reports and school catalogs from the early 1880s outlined trades taught and the number of pupils sent from Lakota and Northern Cheyenne families. The effect on language and ceremony was immediate. Children spoke English in classrooms and were punished for Lakota or Cheyenne speech. Yet language persisted in homes and winter storytelling, and in the quiet of camps away from the agent's eye. Ceremonies adapted to new rules. Some moved out on the prairie beyond view. Others compressed into acceptable forms. A people that had held together under fire now learned to hold together under a desk. Cultural continuance did not end with the new lines on maps. Winter counts painted by keepers placed the year of the fight as a fixed star in a long sky of events. Ledger art by Lakota and Northern Cheyenne men who had fought at the river carried sequences of charges, retreats, and rescues onto paper taken from traders and soldiers. The Smithsonian National Anthropological Archives now holds the pictographic account drawn by Red Horse in 1881, a set of images that display the field in its true geometry of many small surges rather than a single legend. Wooden Leg's narrative recorded years later added detail to those drawings and to the daily life that framed them. The battlefield itself became a record. Markers rose for soldiers in the first decades, and for native warriors much later, as scholars and families argued from drawings, testimony, and archaeology to fix names to places. Commemorations in June brought families back to the valley to remember and to teach. Present day, continuance is the clearest proof that the story did not end on the ridges. The Lakota Oceti live in communities centered at Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, Rosebud Reservation, South Dakota, Cheyenne River Reservation, South Dakota, Standing Rock Reservation, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and others. The Tsitsistas, also called the Northern Cheyenne, live at Northern Cheyenne Reservation, Montana. The Northern Arapaho live at Wind River Reservation, Wyoming. Each nation runs programs in language immersion, early childhood instruction, and youth camps. Buffalo restoration herds graze again on tribally managed grass and supply meat to elders and school kitchens. Cultural departments support Sundance ceremonies, naming feasts and veteran honors. History offices maintain archives of family photographs, winter counts, and government papers, and lead public tours on the battlefield that begin not with defeat, but with survival. The records that mark this aftermath belong in the narrative as quietly as stones along a trail. The United States statutes at large for 1807 printed the Black Hills seizure and the new conditions for annuities. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, 1807 and 1878, described ration policy and agency enforcement. The annual report of the Secretary of War, 1878, summarized continued field operations and the consolidation of bands. The Reno Court of Inquiry, 1879, gathered sworn recollections that shaped blame and doctrine for a generation. The Indian census rolls in later decades traced households who had once crossed the Little Bighorn, now counted by agent and ledger. The Red Horse drawings of 1881 in the Smithsonian and the later publication of Wooden Leg's account preserved indigenous views of the fight and its costs. To walk from one of these records to the next is to watch a policy move from paper to prairie and back again. Memory stands where law once ran strongest. On the bluffs and valleys of the field, markers name soldiers and now also name Lakota and Cheyenne dead, where families and scholars have agreed. Each June, the valley carries song and prayer. School classes visit and listen to elders who narrate the day with hands and with silence. The place reads as both battlefield and classroom. The structural forces that began with a treaty and hardened under gold, and orders remain visible in land titles, rail corridors, and agency towns. Yet, the continuance runs alongside. Language classes meet, buffalo herds breathe in winter steam. Youth ride between camps on trails older than the railroad grade. The story that began with a vision and a march continues as law and land and memory, held by nations that are present tense and whose programs and ceremonies keep the next generation on the ground that once decided a summer. Across a long view, most scholars agree on 3 points. First, the scale and cohesion of the Lakota Tsitsistas and Arapaho village, combined with the regiment's division across broken ridges, produced a geometry that the 7th Cavalry could not repair once contact began. Second, terrain and time, rather than a single dramatic error, determined the ending. Separation from the pack train, poor sight lines, and staggered decisions removed options faster than new ones could be made. Third, the battle cannot be read apart from policy toward the Black Hills and the winter order that forced movement to agencies. The field was the instrument of a prior decision. Disagreements persist and they matter. Estimates of warrior strength range from several hundred in early army returns to well over 1,000 in later syntheses that use family roles and oral histories. Each method carries gaps. The final minutes on the northern ridges have competing reconstructions drawn from archaeology, ledger art, and scattered testimony. Some place a last attempt toward a northern ford, while others see only successive pockets collapsing in place. The roles of particular leaders are read differently. Many indigenous accounts emphasize Crazy Horse and Gall moving men in short, coordinated surges. Some army-centered narratives downplay named leadership and stress the pressure of numbers. The Reno withdrawal through the timber divides assessment between a necessary break from encirclement and a disorder that worsens separation. On each point, credible viewpoints exist because the surviving record is partial and the ground is complex. The enduring legacy is double. In doctrine, the United States Army re-examined reconnaissance concentration and combined arms on the plains. Later operations favored tighter junctions, heavier firepower at the point of contact, and more conservative pursuit when intelligence was thin. In public memory, the event forced a reckoning with treaty promises and seizure of the Black Hills. For the Lakota Oceti and the Northern Cheyenne, the legacy is continuance recorded in winter counts, ledger drawings, and June commemorations on the valley floor. For the wider country, it became a symbol bent two ways at once, as both a story of defeat for the regiment and a demonstration that Native nations could mass maneuver and protect their families under extreme pressure. Right against the causes, the assessment closes simply. A treaty framework strained by gold, a winter reporting order, and a summer plan for compulsion met a village that moved first to safeguard people and then to fight on terms chosen by ground. The long arc that followed carried law allotment and schools, but also language classes, buffalo herds, and prayer circles that returned to the site. This event endures in memory because it joined vision to strategy and made a nation face the cost of breaking its own word. We've seen how terrain speed and a split command pivoted Little Bighorn and why Lakota and Cheyenne communities still carry that memory. Where, in your view, was the exact turning point, the valley or the ridges? How do you rate scouting and resupply? Thank you for watching.